Good evening, everyone. We do hope that you are keeping well. My name is Donna Iene Davis, and I am the director for the Center for the Study of Women and Society. We host so many events throughout the year, and we look forward to soon having them in person. But in the meantime, we are very excited about tonight's event. Tonight, we are so pleased to host this evening's discussion with one of our faculty in the Women and Gender Studies program, Professor Rupal Oza. Professor Oza is in the Department of Women and Gender Studies at Hunter College, the Earth and Environmental Studies program, and the Women and Gender Studies program at the CUNY Graduate Center. Her work focuses on socio-political transformations in the global South, the geography of the right-wing polities, and the transformation in the global South, and the conjecture between gender, violence, and political economy. Her first book, The Making of Neoliberal India, Nationalism, Gender, and the Paradoxes of Globalization, was published in 2006. She has several articles in peer-reviewed journals on a range of issues, including human rights in an age of terror and empire, rethinking area studies, special economic zones in India, and realigned geographies after 9/11. Her most recent articles appear in Signs and Gender, Place, and Culture. Her book-length monograph entitled Semiotics of Rape, Sexual Violation and Subjectivity in Rural India is forthcoming from Duke University. We can't wait until it comes out. It should be out in the fall. And tonight's talk is entitled Ties to Land, Sexual Violation and Political Economy in Rural India. Please join me in welcoming Professor Rupal Oza.
Thank you so much, Donna, for the invitation and introduction. And I echo you in hoping that we can be in person so soon. So thank you all very much. I have to say special thanks to Eileen, to John and Jen at the GC for making this possible. My gratitude to all the sponsoring programs. I'm so grateful for them. And to all of you who have joined. I wish I could see you all in person. A word of caution. I will be talking about gender violence. Please do what you need to do to take care of yourself as you hear these brutal narratives. My talk today is from my forthcoming book, Semiotics of Rape, which is based on research I did in rural Haryana starting in 2016. Haryana is a small, predominantly rural state northwest of Delhi. In the book, rather than ask why rape happens, I pivot to inquiring instead what a rape case does. I look at rape cases as sites where anxieties and battles over changing gender politics, rural crisis, complex sexual subjectivity, and caste politics are negotiated. In the book, I focus on how rape is understood and maneuvered in the vernacular among bureaucrats, lawyers, police officers, activists, different groups in the village, caste communities, and finally, the victim and her kin. Through a focus on sexual subjectivity, I pay attention to how women navigate their cases, what they have to say about the choices they make, and how they, at times, defy the abjection to which they are subject. I examine how the narratives by different constituencies functioned as a series of scripts produced to secure particular outcomes at different scales. Today, I want to talk about the relationship between sexual violation and private property. In the book, this chapter on land undergirds the story of rape. I follow how the social life of rape in rural Haryana is navigated through differential caste and community access to land. Beyond direct causal connections between land disputes and sexual assault, land anchors social relationships in Haryana. So let me begin the story. A network of national highways connects Delhi to Punjab, which pass through Haryana. Within a few miles of crossing the border at Bahadurgarh, the oppressive congestion of Delhi fades. Depending on the time of year, both sides of the highway are vibrant with yellow sarso, mustard fields, or acres of tender shoots of dhan, rice. Haryana is famous for its roadside dhabas, local restaurants that serve hearty local cuisine to travelers going north and west on these highways. A thriller Bollywood film, NH10, named after one such highway, which passes through Haryana, is about a young couple that stops at one of these dhabas. The film follows the story of this couple and their unexpected encounter with a young woman who pleads for their help against a gang of village men pursuing her and her lover. The couple is horrified to witness her murder in an honor killing, and when they attempt to intervene, both are assaulted and one of them is eventually killed. The grief and torment of these experiences propel the lead character, played by popular actress Anushka Sharma, to avenge the crimes by killing the men from the village. The film resonated with the dominant cultural imaginary of Haryana as a dangerous place that is hostile to women, a place where the rule of law is suspended and where justice can only be achieved through vengeance. This is, of course, profoundly problematic. And my effort in the book is to dislodge the fusing of people with places. And yet, despite my efforts to be as attentive as possible, I'm aware that the contradictory implications of this narrative may prove my efforts insufficient. And so it is with some trepidation I am talking about rape in Haryana, which risks reinforcing congealed constructions of brutality and excess to the global south. Maiyar is a village in Haryana, located just off the highway, about 3 hours from the Delhi border. It's an unremarkable village with semi-permanent structures and a few shops on either side of the highway, which cuts through the village. Passing through, one often sees men in white kurta pajama gathered in conversation around a hookah or on tractors and bikes. This unremarkable village, however, is famous as the epicenter of Jat protests that have erupted each year since 2010. Jats are a dominant agricultural caste in Haryana that own 80% of the land, even though they constitute only 27% of the population. Jats were protesting to demand their inclusion in the other backward classes category, which sets aside 27% of seats in government jobs and educational institutions for OBCs. Past efforts by Jats to be included in the OBC category had been unsuccessful and challenged in court. In light of these failures, Jats had escalated their agitation. In Maiyar, Jats blocked the highway and railways, significantly impacting trade and transportation lines. In February 2016, just as I was initiating research for this book, the agitations demanding reservations suddenly turned violent. Highways were shut down, shops and buses were burned, hundreds were injured, and 20 people were killed. the army was called out to restore peace. A Dalit activist lawyer warned me that I should not come to Haryana then and wait for the agitations to die down. When I arrived in Haryana in March, the army was still stationed in some places, and signs of burnt shops and damaged homes were everywhere. The story of why Jats were agitating when they were the dominant group and owned most of the land is a chronicle about entitlement, caste politics, and neoliberalism. Prem Chaudhary explains that Jats became a dominant caste under colonial rule because men from this region were considered a martial race, ideal for recruitment into the British Army. Post-independence, Jats consolidated their power after the Green Revolution in the 1960s and 70s. The Green Revolution transformed Haryana from a poor state that mainly produced cattle fodder during the British colonial period and was then a subsistence economy post-independence to a strong grain surplus economy by the 1970s. High productivity propelled Haryana into being one of the richest states in the Union, the impact of which was felt at the scale of the village and household and drove Jats into power. Haryana's powerful community of Jat farmers began to consolidate and mobilize into unions to demand subsidies and higher prices for their produce. Consequently, a new agrarian elite farmer emerged, who spoke not only on his own behalf, but also for his caste and class, as well as for the village as a whole. These caste politics were therefore baked into the social and political fabric of the state. Caste power translated into electoral politics, whereby 7 out of 10 of Haryana's chief ministers have been Jat, and they are overrepresented in the bureaucracy, law, and police. The power that Jats had accrued by the 1970s began to change in the 1980s. The productive impacts of the Green Revolution were rapidly declining against rising cost of pesticides, fertilizers, and electricity to pump diminishing supply of groundwater to irrigate water-intensive crops. As India embraced neoliberalism, the political prominence Jat farmers had once enjoyed dwindled. As agriculture and rural India receded from the national discourse of economic prosperity, industry and service took center stage. The impact of rural decline and crisis was visible in villages across Haryana, where previously farming had been the biggest employer. Now fewer and fewer people depended on farming, and a new generation sought jobs elsewhere. The most coveted of these were government positions, which were hard to come by and usually required the payment of an enormous bribe to secure. The Jat agitations I mentioned above are in an effort to secure 27% of these coveted government jobs for the kin of Jat farmers under the OBC category. I lay out this political economic context to emphasize that when a charge of rape is filed, it occurs in this complex terrain of rural crisis and caste politics. The significance of which is particularly apparent when the charge of rape is filed by Dalits, the formerly untouchable caste, against the dominant Jat caste. Access to property and land play a huge role in the dispute. Dalits are coerced to withdraw their case in a variety of ways. I came to understand sexual violation as connected to these stories of land and crisis. sometimes directly, and at other times tangentially. I argue that the consequences of a rape charge cannot fully be discerned unless we unpack how women's sexual subjectivity is tied to concerns with land and property in Haryana. My attempt is to dislodge the locus of gender violence and its response as primarily focused on an individual violation and situated within structures of land, caste, and class. So in what follows, I briefly lay out the ways in which land and caste are imbricated in the social life of rape through three kinds of disputes: common land, social boycott and public space, and finally, private property and public violence. In March 2014, 4 Dalit girls were gang raped by 5 Jat men in the village of Bhagana in Haryana. The girls were all under the age of 18 and were kidnapped and found several hundred miles away at Bhatinda railway station in the neighboring state of Punjab. This story, which made headlines, involved a land dispute. To untangle this complex tale, I meet Satish, who is one of the key members of the group protesting for accountability. He has been agitating in front of the district administrative offices for the past 7 years, living there in makeshift tents through the intensely hot and the bitterly cold months. It is a warm winter day in mid-January when we sit in the sun and he begins to tell me the story of land and assault in Bhagana, which began with dispute over a playground. And it is with this story I want to talk about common land. When the Jat agitations began in Mayargaon, Satish told me, it had an impact in Bhagana. Recall that Mayar is the village I mentioned earlier that was the epicenter of Jat agitations for reservations. Bhagana is the neighboring village to Mayar. While disputes and conflicts between Jats and Dalits in Bhagana had been ongoing, in 2011, the situation drastically changed. That year, the Jat agitations in Mayar suddenly turned violent, and a Jat village chief was elected in Bhagana. The previous chief in Bhagana was a Brahmin and had supported Dalits against Jats because they had voted for him. The conflict between Dalits and Jats began because Jats had blocked off a road that Dalits used to access farmland. The Brahmin Sarpanch, the village chief, helped the Dalits by offering them passage through his fields, which angered the Jats. So when a Jat Sarpanch was elected in 2011, in retaliation, he formed a committee that decided that all Shamlat Zameen, all common land in the village, would be divided in proportion to land ownership. Those who had biggest plots of land got a bigger share, and those that were landless got a small share. In this redistribution scheme, Jats took over a playground that Dalits had been using for years. Running their tractors over the playground, they destroyed benches and uprooted trees. Jats claimed that Dalits had illegally occupied the land and that it was part of village common land, which had been set aside for redistribution. When Dalits responded by registering complaints in district offices, Jats escalated the conflict and began to make threats. They commenced a total social and economic boycott against Dalits, including actions like building walls around a village square that blocked Dalit homes and prevented Dalits from accessing the space. Over the next few years, these escalating tensions and the intensifying violence in the village as well as the growing agitations by Jats in the neighboring village of Mayyar, shaped the context in which 4 girls belonging to Dhanak, a Dalit caste, were gang raped by 5 men in 2014. Many believed that the Jats had raped the girls in retaliation for the land dispute and as a way to teach Dalits a lesson. The relationship between land dispute and sexual violation in Bhagana was, at least initially, clearly part of ongoing intercaste conflicts. In other villages I looked at, the relationship was not as linear, but it was still part of a larger context involving disputes between Jats and Dalits. I encountered similar issues with dispute over common land in Malur, where in 2012, 15-year-old Sheetal was gang raped by 12 Jat men. The police arrested 8 men and eventually convicted 4. The case in Malur was different. Here, under a government scheme, Dalits had been allocated plots on common land to build homes. Over the past few years, the conflict in Malur over plots of land for Dalit homes had resulted in litigation in the civil courts. The plaintiffs in the case claimed that the Shamlad Zameen in the village was ancestral property and that their families had given to the village panchayat for common purposes. Based on this claim, that land could not be given to Dalits to build homes. This conflict generated resentment between Jats and Dalits. In my conversation with Dalit elders, I asked if Sheetal's gang rape was in retaliation for this land dispute, but they denied it. While there was no connection between the assault on Sheetal and the land dispute, in my conversation with Sheetal, she said that soon after her gang rape, prominent Jat members of the village came and specifically referred to the dispute over common land. She recalled that they told her family that if they were to agree to compromise the case, then they would allow the village panchayat to build homes for the Dalit community on Shamlad Zameen. In this way, by holding the land that was owed to Dalit families hostage, efforts were made to coerce not only Sheetal and her family, but also the entire community. The tactic of holding an entire Dalit community hostage to get relief or to try and coerce a compromise out of court is one that is commonly deployed. Sheetal refused to compromise on the rape case, and the litigation over ownership of common land was rejected by civil courts. In retaliation for the loss they faced in both instances, Jats in the village ran their tractors over the plots of land where homes for Dalits were slotted for construction. One of the Dalit women I spoke with in the village said that the Haveli wale, those that reside in the big house, had sat overnight on the land that was marked for Dalit families, carrying rifles and preventing anyone from getting access to it. When I visited the village 4 years later, the land remained unused. Efforts to claim it to build homes for Dalits had continued to be unsuccessful. One morning, a Jat woman who was attending a religious gathering at a temple conceded in her conversation with me that the Jat boys who had raped the young Dalit girl were in the wrong. But she felt that despite this, it was Jats who bore the brunt of having their reputation sullied because Jat boys had gone to jail. Under such circumstances, she felt it was not possible to give Dalits what she claimed was their land. The social boycott of Dalit families in Bhagana began in 2012 after they filed complaints in court about the destruction of their playground. Jats demanded that no one employ Dalits or buy anything from them. They also imposed a 200 rupee fine on anyone who spoke with Dalits in the village. Since most Dalits work on Jat farmlands, the boycott prohibited anyone from employing Dalits. Social boycott, in addition to ongoing economic disenfranchisement, retrenched Dalits' lack of access to public spaces. While codes of caste have always differentiated space between dominant and subordinate castes, where people eat, defecate, reside, are all subject to discriminatory rules of ritual purity, the boycott went beyond these controls, prohibiting Dalits from accessing public space critical to their survival. Public spaces are different from Shamlat Zameen, common land, which is administered by the village panchayat for common purposes in the village. In contrast, public spaces like crossroads or village squares are used to access village life. As part of social boycotts, Jats seeking to subject Dalits to pressure or punishment block off public spaces, prohibiting gatherings, marriage processions, and celebrations. In Bhagana, Jats retaliated to ongoing disputes by blocking off Chamar Chowk, a crossroad in the village named after one of the Dalit subcastes. Tensions between dominant caste Jats and Dalits predate the gang rape of the 4 Dalit girls. And according to Satish, it was the conflict over land and Dalits' refusal to give up and give in that led to the violent assaults. The rape made national news when the families from Bhagana went to Delhi to protest in April 2014. The resulting public pressure led to the arrest of 5 men. When the case went up for trial, however, all 5 men were acquitted. Satish claimed that the men were acquitted because of social pressure on Dalits by Jats in the village. In the lead up to the trial, rumors about a relationship between one of the Dalit girls and one of the Jat men surfaced. 5 years later, when I visited Bhagana, most of the families had returned to the village. There was a split in opinion among Dalit activists about the outcome of the case. At the village, we meet Savitri and Poonam, the mothers of 2 of the 4 women who had been raped, and Arun, an activist who worked with Satish. Savitri explained, 2 का फैसला हो गया, एक लड़की का बाप मर गया, फिर हम अकेले रह गए, फिर कोई नहीं लड़िया केस. 2 of the girls compromised. One of the girls' father died, and we were left alone. We did not want to fight the case. Savitri and Poonam challenged Arun and other activists who implored them to continue with the case, each explaining that manne bhi gaam mein rehna hai. I too have to live in the village. Their earlier lament of having been left alone, along with their emphasis on having to continue to live in the village, expose the constraints they faced in the choices they could make. Later on, Savitri added, "Bhains bhi bandi hai gaam mein. Our buffaloes are tied here." Savitri and Poonam had livestock in the village and needed to go back to take care of their buffaloes. For many poor landless families, livestock is an important source of income, and their livelihoods depend on it. Owning buffaloes was one of the only ways poor families had to supplement their living. a reality which was even more urgent after Jats launched their crushing social boycott against them. The phrase, "Gaam mein rehna hai," we have to live in the village, was often repeated among those who compromised their cases by settling them out of court. It was meant to signal that they are tied to the village and had to go back. So they had to find a way to live there. Savitri and Poonam felt that their reputation had been sullied from the case and that the case was causing them to suffer for the isolation in the village. They said there was no ana jana, coming and going with the families of the other girls, and that the incidents, the rape and the aftermaths, had led to tensions among the community in the village. Since the gang rape case had ended in a compromise, the girls and their families were followed by a shadow of guilt, suggesting that the girls were responsible for what had happened. This badnami, disrepute, according to Poonam, would make it difficult to secure a good marriage for her daughter. She wanted the whole episode of rapes and protests to be in the past and to move on with her life. The social pressures of arranging marriages and continuing to live in the village limited the stamina families had for continuing to struggle for their rights and for justice. Let me conclude with the last site of private land and public violence with a story from Jaswadi, which tells a tale of land dispute and brutal assault. When I first met Komal, it was on the farmland where they grow cattle fodder. I was accompanied at this initial meeting by her friend Sheetal, whose own story of gang rape in Malur I briefly mentioned above. The story of Komal's rape had garnered a fair bit of attention when in November 2012, she was allegedly gang raped by 4 men, 2 Jat and 2 belonging to other backward classes from her village. Komal's Tau, father's older brother, helped register the case and supported the family through the tedious process of lodging a complaint and getting the case to court. When I met Komal, 4 years had passed and she was over 20 years old, had dropped out of school and was reluctant to return to her studies. The story of Komal's assault had elicited tremendous support from Dalit lawyers, activists, and human rights groups. In the years since her assault, her case had not been resolved. And when I first met her in 2016, there was conversation in the village about resolving the case through a compromise. 8 months later, a samjhauta was reached. Komal insisted through the negotiations of the compromise that she was happy about it. She repeatedly claimed to me that the 4 men accused of her rape were innocent. I had heard horrifying stories about how Dalits are forced to compromise their cases and was concerned that Komal and her family were also being threatened. Then one day, she cleared my confusion and concern. I had come to visit because I was on my way back to Delhi for a few days and wanted to make sure that things had settled down. It was early in the day, around 10 in the morning, when I reached her home. The sun was already blisteringly hot. We sat in one of the 2 rooms. There was no electricity and the fan did not work. As we sat in the shade attempting to cool ourselves with handheld fans, I asked about the case. Komal sat in front of me and said in a quiet voice, "Rape nahi hua. I was not raped." I was surprised to hear her say this and asked her to tell me what she meant. As she began to recall the incident, her eyes brimmed with tears and her voice cracked. She said the boys had come to ask after her brother. She was home from school for lunch and told them that her brother was away in college. She offered to give them his number so they could call him. Her uncle saw her talking to the boys with a phone in her hand and forced her inside and began to beat her. Home alone that day, with his wife and daughter out, he dragged Komal's slight body into the home. And then, as Komal recounted while sobbing, he dragged her up to the loft. Once there, he took a thick stick from a particular kind of bush with thorns and struck her behind. Komal continued to describe the horror that unfolded, how her uncle proceeded to hit and punch her before using a handle of a shovel to sodomize her. She said she lost consciousness and woke up several hours later at a local hospital with her uncle right there in the room with her. He had already spoken with the doctors and told them that she had been raped by 4 boys. The medical report reflected the story of rape as Komal's uncle had told it. Since it is often a male member of a girl's family who accompanies her to file a complaint, the uncle's version of the story had gone unquestioned. Komal described how circumstances would not allow her to say what had happened. For one, her uncle always made sure to be around when she was questioned about the assault. When the father of one of the boys came to ask what had happened and asked if he could speak with Komal, Komal's uncle had threatened to hurt him. Before Komal and her uncle went to speak with a lawyer, he threatened her with more violence and warned her to repeat the story exactly as he had told her. Since then, whenever Komal had tried to tell anyone the truth, her uncle had threatened to beat her. She feared him, and so did others. When she sought refuge by going to stay with an aunt, her uncle repeatedly called and threatened her aunt and her family. The threats reached such peaks that Komal was eventually sent back home. Since the assault by her uncle, he has engaged in a persistent campaign of harassment and violence against Komal and her family. I encountered one such incident when he had beaten up Komal, her brother, and his wife badly. It took a group of us to get them to the hospital and get them treated for their injuries. When I asked Komal and her father about the cause of his ongoing animosity, I learned that it was rooted in a simmering dispute between the family and her uncle. Komal had offered hints about this dispute during our conversation, but it would be only later that I learned the full story. Komal and her father would recall that the dispute with the uncle had been ongoing for many years and had to do with the small plot of land they owned. On a hot summer day in May, I got a call from Komal asking me to come by and see her. She said her uncle was harassing them. When I got to the village, Komal explained that the uncle had stopped water from coming to their land and had blocked its flow by putting in kapas, cotton, behind their backs, and was insisting that the land be turned over to his name. He claimed that he had spent a lot of money for Komal's brother's wedding and her rape case, and that they owed him. In exchange for the sum of money he said he spent for their benefit, he wanted the land converted to his name. The khata, land revenue record, was in Komal's grandfather's name, which was then divided amongst his 7 sons and daughters. The land totaled 7 acres. Komal's father tilled 1.5 acres. Among the 4 brothers and 3 sisters, the sisters all supported the eldest brother in his contest over Komal's father's land. We filed a complaint against this uncle in the courts to challenge his most recent efforts of coercion, which involved stopping the water from flowing to their farm. Each time I returned to find what had happened to this complaint, I saw that not much had changed over the course of 2 years, and that the hostility and threats remained. Komal's uncle's hostility and occasional bouts of violence against her and her family over the years were all aimed at coercing her father to give up his claim on the land. By law, Komal's father was entitled to the land unless he legally gave up his share to his brother. Assaults on women to compel an outcome of such a dispute are not unusual. So while Komal may not have had any control over the land, the brutal attack on her and the occasional violent attacks on her brothers generated a threat to the family and functioned as pressure to coerce them into acquiescing to the uncle's demands. Of all the stories I researched, Komal's was the most heartbreaking. She was so young and in so many ways so fragile. While she never articulated what her uncle did to her as rape, she was able to wrest control of her case away from him through the compromise. It was both a joy to meet her, as well as eviscerating to witness her story. 6 months after the compromise in her case was finalized, I heard that Komal's marriage was being arranged. A prior marriage prospect had been ruined by her uncle, who remained resentful of the compromise in her case and had threatened Komal and her family and even her lawyer. When she finally married, I spoke with her and her husband on the phone and was relieved to hear her sound happy. But like so much in her young life, that happiness was short-lived when, less than a year into her marriage, her brother's wife, with whom she was close and who had just given birth to a little boy, died. Komal's niece and baby nephew were now living with their maternal grandparents, since, given patriarchal marriage arrangements, Komal had gone to live with her husband. Only her father and younger brother were left at her previous home, and they could not take care of the children once their mother died. Let me draw this to a close. My effort to recount these stories of dispute and violence illustrates what Rana Jaleel has called, quote, rape's intimacies with property, which are roughly tethered to expropriations of resources, lives, and land, unquote. In these intimacies, caste relations braid together who has access to resources and land. Jats have derived their power through a history of access and control over 80% of land in Haryana. Their diminishing power has fueled violence and ongoing agitation to demand reservations in educational institutions and government jobs to secure livelihood options for their future sons. For Dalits, though, who have little to no land, decades of government redistribution schemes have led to some upward mobility. This shift in balance of power is intolerable to many in the dominant castes. Rapes of Dalit women in Haryana are often narrated as being about the need to teach them a lesson. But Dalits are not willing to acquiesce to this violence and are fighting to get cases concerning violence against them registered and taken to court. As one police officer said to me, "Ab log jagrut ho gaye hain." People are more aware of their rights. Examining how land intertwines with assault across the three sites I have recounted helps craft a better understanding of the structures that determine and impede the lives of both the powerful and the vulnerable. Long-standing tentacles of tradition inform the entitlement to land displayed by the dominant caste, such that when common land is slated for redistribution among those at the bottom rungs of caste and economy, dominant caste repression is swift and fierce. In the villages I visited, little, if any, land was redistributed through these schemes without fierce backlash by those in the dominant caste. As it has been done historically, the state colludes with the dominant caste in these instances, because those who fill its rank and file come from the same dominant caste communities. Dalits' lack of access to land and their dependence on larger landlords mean that at the scale of the village, those who work on farms are vulnerable to social pressures to compromise, adjust, and acquiesce. The story of compromise in Bhagana is ambiguous, and it remains unclear if the girls' families were coerced to compromise their sexual assault cases, or if they did so because of the vulnerability they felt. Either way, the structures of these Dalit families' lives were such that they had to return to their village to figure out how to live within the confines of life there. Whether tacitly or explicitly, the circumstances of their lives produce a limited set of choices that are unlikely to have offered the most just outcomes for the girls and for what they've had to endure. At the scale of the intimate, like in Komal's case, who will not inherit land, but assaults against them render them victims of stories emerging from structures that are not of their making. They are the vulnerable subjects in disputes about access to property rooted in vast class and caste inequality. Rape in Haryana is not simply a story about the violation of bodily integrity. It is part of a complex range of structures in which women and girls become vulnerable subjects in a dispute that is ultimately not about them. Thank you.
Oh my goodness, thank you so much. That was such a stunning presentation. And I would like to invite the audience to post questions in the Q&A. But in order to give you all a little bit of time to get your thoughts together, I'm going to start with, I have two questions. I actually have three. But the first will be about your method. So, obviously your work is empirically based. Can you describe the methodological approach that you took to do this work? And were there compromises that you had to make? And could you just talk about that for a moment?
Thank you, Donna. That's a great question. I think, so there's a few things I have to say about this. Obviously, when one does research on violence, and particularly intimate violence, it's incredibly complicated. And obviously my foremost concern was about re-traumatizing the women, the families, the communities, putting them in danger and so on. And one's class and caste position is visible on one's bodies, right? The way I dressed, how I went to Haryana in a car, all of it was visible. So there was very clear differences between the women I was interviewing or talking with and my own caste and class position. I began my research motivated by the story of Bhagana, which is the one that I was talking about in the paper today. And when I started, my intention was not to research specifically Dalit rape. That was not. I wanted to just research rape and figure out really the relationship between land, violence, and gender, and the ways in which those work together. But finding cases of rape are very, very hard. They're very difficult. It's not like somebody's going to come out and tell you. And so I began working with women's groups and organizations that had done what are called fact-finding reports on cases in Haryana. Mm-hmm. And so it is through those cases that I got to know. And once in Haryana, then I collaborated with activists there. The problem was that a lot of the cases were written about Dalit women, not about Jat women, not about dominant caste women at all. And when I went around researching and trying to find rape cases about other women that were not Dalit, what was told to me was, and this happened over and over and over again, was that, of course, rape happens everywhere. And of course, Jat women are also raped. But the cases are immediately suppressed in the village. They don't get to court. They don't get to the police station. They get nowhere. They're immediately suppressed within the families, within the community, etc. And unlike Dalit organizations that had formed activist groups, and there were other kinds of things, given the atrocities that Dalits have had to endure for, well, several hundred years, but over the last several years in Haryana, there was at least an activist network that would amplify stories or offer resources and other kinds of things. So there were avenues available for them, not for Jat women. The stories and the dilemmas that I confronted were trying to find cases. The only cases I researched were ones that had previously been researched by women's organizations or activist groups. And my book is based on an in-depth look at 8 cases.
I see. Okay. Thank you. I'd like to ask one follow-up question before moving on to the audience, that, or maybe it's a point of clarification. I'm interested in knowing the degree to which the courts may have been populated primarily by members of the Jat caste, which would, of course, create a kind of a possible protraction, I suppose, of those cases. The court cases never went to court. I mean, they were, of the ones you studied, they were always suppressed, or was there ever a case that went to court? And what was that? Was there a public spectacle about it, a resistance? You know, what was the nature of it?
Okay, so there's a difference between how rape cases are adjudicated in the US versus in India. In the US, you know, you go to the DA decides whether this is a viable case and takes it forward or not. A lot of the times it doesn't take it forward. In India, the law is when a rape case is registered with the police station, what is filed is something called an FIR, a first information report. When an FIR is filed, that the police start an investigation, the victim is brought in front of a magistrate, and it has to go to court. Like it cannot get suppressed. You cannot not take it to court. It is by law, it has to go forward.
Okay.
At this point, when an FIR is registered, is when very, very often cases, and in the village particularly, there is a tremendous pressure to compromise. So, for example, when Sheetal's gang rape case was filed and registered, etc., there was enormous pressure, as I was talking about in the paper, to not only Sheetal and her family. Sheetal was told, and her family. Sheetal never gets. The conversation is never with the woman herself. Her family is told that we will give you so much land, or we will give the community so much land, and so on. When cases are go to court, and there are many that go on to court, and there are many judges who are appointed as what are called special sessions judges, who are dominant caste and so on, who adjudicate fairly and adjudicate with, compassion and all the rest of it. So it's not entirely as if that never happens, or just because it's the dominant caste and so on. It's just that, as we would talk about in terms of court, I guess here, and white supremacy here, is the ways in which the very understanding of somebody's humanity and subjectivity sort of saturated with, or is saturated with not really comprehending, where they come from, or giving them a fair shot. In another part of the book, I write about how the courts are unable to recognize caste in terms in the violence that of rape, right? Very similar in some ways to what Crenshaw and others talk about in terms of Black women. I mean, so much of the, work I draw on actually is from Black feminists and Dalit feminists to think through violence by Jats onto women's bodies.
Thank you. All right, I'm going to turn to the audience questions. I'll start with the first one from Virginia Valian. I think I've said the name correctly, who says, thank you, Rupal, and wonders if you see any parallels elsewhere in the world.
Oh, hi, Virginia. I wish I could see you in person. I miss seeing all of you. There are parallels, of course, whether it is here or elsewhere. I mean, I think I haven't done comparative work, and in some ways this ties to Donna's earlier question, and some of my students might be also in the audience. And I'm an empiricist. I like doing empirical work. It is incredibly hard. It's really, really, really hard. Anybody who's done empirical works knows this. It's very hard. It's unbelievably heartbreaking. But because I am so committed to doing empirically based work, and I really want to, look at and peel back the layers of the onion, looking at what is taking place in sort of the minutia of a particular context, I look at that. But the parallels were with the DRC, for example. Mukwege was here at Hunter. This is pre-pandemic, and was talking about that. And, you see so many similarities in the ways in which cases are dismissed, women's concerns are dismissed, communities are threatened, et cetera, et cetera. And so there are multiple parallels. I just haven't done sort of any kind of comparative work, but in stories that I have read about elsewhere, it resonates, which is why also I draw on actually Saadia Hartman's work when she's looking at the work in terms of understanding subjectivity and violence and slavery.
Mm-hmm. Francine Leonard but thanks you for your dedication and commitment in telling these stories.
Thank you.
You do have a question from your colleague, Linda Martin Alcoff. Linda says, wonderful paper. One confusing part was why the Jat, am I saying that correctly?
Yes, Jat. Mm-hmm.
Rapists were motivated to rape, even though they were concerned about the adverse effects on their reputation. So what do you make of this, given that the motive for the rapes, as you show, were calculated to benefit the rapists?
Let me make sure I understand the question. So why were Jats motivated to rape, even though they were the benefits they were getting?
Even though they were concerned about the effects on their reputation.
Right.
So
okay.
In other words, right. Okay.
Yes. Thank you, Linda, for coming through my paper and for the question. I think the thing with Jats, I did not interview, obviously, the accused. Some of them were, they were not willing to obviously talk with me, and some of them were in jail, so I couldn't meet them. But I think the manner in which I got to understand intercaste relationships were about a sense of entitlement. I don't think they worried that much that their reputation would be sullied. I think when the woman was saying our reputation is sullied, the men that were involved in this were not that concerned. And it's not entirely the violation of Dalit women or other women is not, I'm not going to say it's common, but it is not something that is startlingly new. And Jat entitlement to power and to the fact that so many cases end in compromise, or 70% of cases anecdotally end in compromise. Compromise is a out-of-court settlement. And in India, criminal cases, it is illegal for criminal cases to be settled out of court. So if you have a rape case, it has to go through the court case, and it cannot be settled out of court. But many of them end in compromise, and how that happens, I can talk about later. Given that, I think that there wasn't that much concern or worry in general expressed to me. There was issues about like, well, they shouldn't do this. And when in particular with, for example, with Sheetal's case, when I met some of the Jat elders, the manner in which they talked to me about it was, well, they said, well, the girl and her mother are working women. Like they said it in Haryana, which is they wo dhanda karte hain. They are, as in to allege, obviously, that they are prostitutes. And so the boys, they would say, well, boys will be boys, and they would do this stuff, but not very much concerned about, what is going to happen in the future.
Okay. The next question comes from Dhruv. I hope I'm saying that correctly, who asks, do you think it will help to sensitize the dominant caste, and specifically men in the dominant caste, to casteism, patriarchy, and intimate violence? If yes, have you seen any examples of sensitization programs, grassroots or top-down? Or are there any other ways to change mindsets and behaviors?
Thank you, Dhruv, for that question. I have not, I haven't seen, I do not know of any programs or efforts to sensitize or change their minds or mindset towards, or how their attitude towards other people. I also wanna, both in terms of Linda's question as well as Dhruv, your question, I wanna, not construct Dalits or Jats in particular as sort of flat, unidimensional figures. These are complex people with complex motivations and complex issues and so on. And part of trying to understand intercaste conflict was trying to understand it in the context of what was taking place in the villages, which is why I was talking, so much of my conversations were about the crisis in the village, the lack of jobs, the amount of debt that every single person was in debt, huge amounts of nasha being, people were intoxicated with drug abuse, massive amounts of it. And so in that context, what I came to understand with Jats in particular, but also about Dalits, was about a group of people confronting what are eviscerating political and economic circumstances and the ways in which that they were talking about it or dealing with it. And so, I hope I don't come across as saying, here are Jats who are evil. I'm more concerned about, presenting a complex story about the situatedness of what is occurring within a particular context in which all of these people's lives are taking place. And in particular, obviously concerned about what happens in terms of violence to Dalit women. But I do not know of programs or efforts to sensitize Jat men. I haven't heard of them.
Okay. You have a thank you from Red Washburn for this wonderful work and talk.
Thank you.
Your work is so important and very interesting. And we've got, it looks like 2 more questions. The first is from Rachel Goff, who says, hello, Rupal. This was a powerful talk. Thank you. You mentioned in the beginning a concern about representation of communities and places as exceptionally violent. Could you say more? And Rachel notes that this question is selfish, as they write about Jamaica. Could you say more about how you navigate telling these stories whilst holding the political concern about representation? Is it post-colonial spaces or these villages in particular?
I always quote this from Stuart Hall, whom I love. And he would always say, you do research on where your heart is.
Yes.
And so, I do research where my heart is, but, it's never, as I'm sure we have talked in the past, our work is never without implication. It's never pure, and it's never without, danger or it's never without risk. So part of my effort, it depends again, right? I mean, Lata Mani had a terrific essay many years ago about how and where what she speaks about changes. So when I talk about it here, I always have this part where I have tremendous trepidation about talking about this stuff because it always can land in places that I have no control over. If I talk about it in India, there's so much that is understood and the idioms are familiar. And there too, I will say, and I will talk about certainly, that let us hold capacity for humanity of everybody, which is why I was trying to sort of say, I don't want to present Jats as being, this demonic figures. Absolutely not. I met plenty of them that, struggled and the rest of it. So I guess my response to that is I try and I offer as much as I can, carefully detailed context and explanation. But I know that very often I fail and it's insufficient. And I hope that in some times when I do speak about this stuff, that it lands in a way that does not do what I don't want it to do. I can only do that.
We now have three questions. Two of them are from the same person. I'm going to ask Charlene Mullet's question first. Were Dalit men ever raped over land? Why or why not? And what are the specific imaginative geographies shaping Dalit women and girls in Haryana? Or perhaps I am hearing some of this now, but a great talk.
I might have you explain to me in terms of what imaginative geographies you mean specifically, but I can take a stab at it. Yes, Dalit men are raped. Do we know about them? Not often. And the reason part of it is, again, because it's probably suppressed. It doesn't come to court. It doesn't come to courts or doesn't get to the polices. But I guess people are violated all the time, everywhere. And I did not hear of one. I'm trying to recall. I did not hear of one, and I certainly did not follow a case about a Dalit man getting raped. The imaginative geographies of Dalit women. I'm not sure I quite know, but let me say this. I would say, let me talk about the geographies of women in Haryana in general. And Dalit women is not very different from other women. When you're in a village in Haryana, you often see women in long tunics and loose pants, kurtas, with a scarf covering their heads completely. So they veil completely, but it's not like the hijab or other things. They veil all the time. It's also very hot. So I guess they're saving themselves with the sun. But women are very visible in public. They are working in the fields all the time. And it is not possible to differentiate between Jat or Dalit women, right? So I would see women around everywhere. Men would be, the geographies are different. So women would be working in the farms or walking or other kinds of things. Oftentimes I saw men playing cards in a bus shelter or in district offices or other kinds of things. Within the home, if I were to see women, they would take off their scarf in front of me, but would veil themselves in front of other men. So for the most part, there was a fluidity to the geography that women occupied, particularly in public spaces and in farmlands. The unexpected encounter I had was with women who were wrestlers, and I was not looking to research them. And they presented very differently. They were gender non-conforming and had a very different physical presence in the village. For most women who were working and had scarves over their heads, etc., they would sort of close in on themselves as they navigated the village spaces. I don't know if that answers your question, Charlene, but thank you for it. But if it doesn't, I'm happy to talk more.
I am so sad to say that we are out of time. You do have 3 questions from Cheryl O'Brien, and it's my hope that you know Cheryl O'Brien, but we're going to copy those questions so that you can have them. But we are out of time, but I just want to say thank you so very, very much for such an incredibly rich talk that you delivered with an incredible degree of integrity, and I would add humility. And thank you so very, very much.
Thank you so much, Donna. And thank you so much, everybody who could come. I am so happy that you could make it, and I hope to see you in person soon. Thank you all very, very much. Thank you, Donna.
Okay, thank you so much.